When one thinks of the Goblin Rebellions, it's easy to picture the grim tales etched into wizarding history. Savage battles, bloodied fields and bitter betrayals that have haunted the magical community for centuries. But these conflicts were far more than skirmishes over power or land. They were, at their heart, a reflection of the deep, uneasy relationship between wizards and goblins. A relationship shaped by prejudice, greed, and mistrust. To understand the Goblin Rebellions, we must first look at the goblins themselves. Few creatures in the wizarding world are as enigmatic or misunderstood as goblins. Small in stature but formidable in intellect, they are master craftsmen, their skill with metal and magic unparalleled. The finest treasures of the wizarding world, jewelry, enchanted blades, and even coins, are their handiwork. Yet goblins have always been treated as second-class citizens by wizards, denied the same rights and freedoms they help uphold. At the heart of this inequality lies a simple but profound cultural chasm. Wizards value ownership, while goblins prize craftsmanship. To a goblin, the maker of an object is its true master, and ownership can never truly transfer. To wizards, however, possession is law. It was this cultural divide that would eventually ignite one of the bloodiest eras in magical history. The roots of the Goblin Rebellions stretch deep into the early days of the wizarding world, when goblins were both indispensable and ostracized. While goblins played a critical role in the establishment of magical banking and commerce, Gringotts itself is their crowning achievement. They were excluded from the halls of power. The Ministry of Magic, then in its infancy, largely ignored goblin grievances, viewing their demands for equality as inconvenient at best and dangerous at worst. Wizard historians often paint the rebellions as senseless acts of goblin aggression, but the truth is more complex. Goblins were not merely waging war for power, they were fighting for respect, recognition, and what they saw as justice. The spark that lit the first rebellion remains shrouded in mystery, though wizarding historians and goblin scholars offer differing accounts. Some claim it began with a dispute over a goblin-made sword, a magnificent weapon imbued with magic that a wizard refused to return to its maker. Others argue that it was an accumulation of slights, a goblin leader insulted, goblin-made treasures confiscated, and heavy taxes imposed on their communities. Whatever the cause, the first rebellion was a declaration that goblins would no longer be subservient to wizard kind. The conflicts that followed were as much battles of wits as they were of wandwork. Goblins, though unable to wield wands themselves, were not defenseless. They used their extraordinary intellect and mastery of magic-infused weaponry to devastating effect. Enchanted traps, cursed blades, and intricate strategies allowed them to hold their own against wizard forces. Yet the violence came at a steep cost. Entire goblin clans were wiped out, and wizarding villages were razed in retaliation. Even within the wizarding community, the rebellions sowed discord, with some wizards questioning the morality of their leaders' actions. Despite the toll of the early rebellions, the tensions between goblins and wizards were far from resolved. In fact, the intermittent ceasefires often did little more than allow both sides to regroup and re-evaluate their strategies. Each rebellion brought with it new leaders, new grievances, and new levels of animosity. The goblins, for their part, were deeply resourceful and united by a shared cultural memory of mistreatment. Wizards, however, were fragmented by internal politics, their responses often hindered by arrogance and underestimation of goblin capabilities. One of the most infamous episodes in the Goblin Rebellions involved the rise of a cunning goblin strategist named Urgak the Fierce. Though goblins have always preferred unity in the face of external threats, Urgak's brilliance elevated him to a near-mythical status among his kin. Legend has it that Urgak was not only a master of goblin magic, but also a gifted orator, capable of rallying even the most disheartened goblin communities. With his vision of a future free from wizarding oppression, under his leadership, the goblins orchestrated what wizard historians often call the Siege of Tintagel, a rebellion so devastating that the ministry was forced to rewrite several laws concerning goblin-made weapons in its aftermath. The Siege of Tintagel itself is a fascinating study in goblin ingenuity. The wizard-controlled stronghold, perched on a jagged cliff and surrounded by natural wards, was thought to be impenetrable. Yet, Urgak's forces managed to infiltrate it, not through brute force, but by exploiting the greed of their enemies. A bribe, disguised as a gift of priceless goblin-forged jewelry, bewitched a high-ranking wizard guard into opening the gates. What followed was not merely a military victory, but a symbolic blow to wizard kind, as goblin banners flew over a stronghold that had once served as a bastion of wizarding dominance. Of course, wizarding accounts of the rebellion often omit the motivations behind such bold actions, focusing instead on the destruction caused. It's true that the siege of Tintagel left hundreds of wizards dead and its surrounding lands in ruin. But for goblins, the siege was not about conquest. It was about sending a message. The banners they raised were adorned not with symbols of goblin supremacy, but with emblems representing craftsmanship, solidarity, and autonomy. To this day, Tintagel remains a contested piece of history, with goblin historians calling it a turning point, and wizards labeling it an act of rebellion steeped in barbarity. The aftermath of the siege marked a particularly dark period for goblin-wizard relations. The Ministry of Magic, embarrassed by its failure to anticipate Urgak's strategy, responded with sweeping crackdowns on goblin communities. Wand legislation, already a source of contention, became even stricter, with the ministry outlawing the production of any goblin-forged weaponry that might pose a threat to wizards. Members of the household family had to close their windows at the end of the night when the peregrine fog arrived, March 1943. For the goblins, this was an intolerable insult. Their crafts were not merely tools of war, they were expressions of art, heritage, and identity. By restricting their craft, the ministry had struck at the very core of goblin culture, ensuring that the embers of rebellion would continue to smolder. These heavy-handed measures also created divisions within the wizarding community itself. Some wizards, particularly those who admired goblin craftsmanship or who had benefited from alliances with goblins in the past, argued for reconciliation rather than suppression. Figures like Ethelred Burbage, a controversial yet respected historian of the time, openly criticised the ministry's policies, claiming that wizard arrogance was perpetuating the cycle of violence. However, Burbage's voice was drowned out by more powerful factions that viewed goblins as inherently dangerous, incapable of peaceful coexistence. This polarization within wizarding society raises an uncomfortable question. Were the Goblin Rebellions truly a war between wizards and goblins, or were they symptomatic of a deeper failure in magical governance? As the rebellions continued, it became increasingly clear that the ministry's reliance on force over dialogue was as much to blame for the bloodshed as any act of goblin defiance. The Goblin Rebellions dragged on for centuries in varying forms, with each uprising building upon the frustrations left unresolved by the last. What made these conflicts so uniquely devastating wasn't just the bloodshed, but the pervasive sense of mistrust and bitterness they embedded into the very fabric of wizarding and goblin society. While wizards viewed goblins as cunning and dangerous, goblins saw wizards as arrogant and untrustworthy, an impasse that seemed destined never to break. One of the most harrowing consequences of this distrust was the rise of draconian wizarding laws designed to keep goblins under control. While official ministry records claim these measures were necessary for public safety, many were clearly aimed at curbing goblin autonomy. The wand ban, perhaps the most infamous of these laws, prohibited goblins from carrying or using wands, despite the fact that many were capable of powerful magic without them. Wizards justified this ban as a way to prevent goblins from becoming too dangerous, though goblins viewed it as a deliberate attempt to keep them subservient. What made the wand ban particularly galling was its hypocrisy. Wizards relied heavily on goblin craftsmanship, enchantments woven into doors, vaults, and weapons, but denied goblins the right to wield their own creations. This double standard only deepened the divide. Goblin forges began operating in secret, crafting items that bore curses or enchantments so subtle that even the most skilled wizard might overlook them. Tales of cursed goblin artifacts, swords that turned on their wielders, coins that drained a thief's magic, became a source of wizarding paranoia. Yet, for goblins, these stories were as much about survival as vengeance. They were reminders of their power, even in the face of oppression. One particularly famous artifact to emerge during this period was the Sword of Godric Gryffindor. While most wizards today know it as a symbol of heroism and bravery, its origins are steeped in controversy. Forged by the Goblin King Ragnarok I, the sword was initially a symbol of goblin craftsmanship at its peak, gleaming silver, set with rubies, and imbued with goblin magic to make it indestructible. According to goblin lore, Gryffindor tricked Ragnarok into parting with the sword, leading to one of the earliest conflicts between goblins and wizards. While wizards tell a different story, one of a fair trade and rightful ownership, the sword became a rallying point for goblins during the rebellions. The Ministry of Magic's mishandling of such symbols only exacerbated tensions. Instead of addressing the cultural divide or attempting diplomacy, ministry officials often sought to suppress goblin uprisings with overwhelming force. One of the bloodiest examples of this occurred during the Battle of Little Hangleton, a decisive clash in which a combined force of auras and hired mercenaries ambushed a goblin encampment. Inside, while the ministry hailed it as a victory for wizarding stability, it was, in reality, a massacre, with goblins, many of them non-combatants, slaughtered in droves. The atrocity sent shockwaves through the goblin community, cementing the ministry's reputation as a ruthless oppressor. It's important to note, however, that not all wizards supported the ministry's heavy-handed tactics. There were pockets of dissent within wizarding society, with some wizards advocating for greater understanding and equality. Secret alliances between wizards and goblins occasionally emerged, though these were risky for both parties. Wizards who sympathized with goblins were often ostracized or accused of treason, while goblins who trusted wizards sometimes found themselves betrayed. Still, these alliances demonstrated that reconciliation, however unlikely, was not entirely impossible. One such alliance is the subject of a particularly compelling piece of goblin folklore, the story of the Starfire Accord. According to goblin legend, a small group of wizards secretly met with goblin leaders during one of the later rebellions and offered to broker peace. These wizards, known only as the Starfire Circle, promised to push for reforms within the ministry in exchange for an end to hostilities. While the details of the accord remain murky, and some historians doubt its existence altogether, goblins speak of it as a moment of rare hope, a glimpse of what might have been if trust had been allowed to flourish. Ultimately, however, the Goblin Rebellions ended not with peace, but with exhaustion. Both sides suffered immense losses, and the magical world was left deeply scarred. The ministry claimed victory, though it was a hollow one. Goblins were never truly defeated, and the grievances that had fueled the rebellions remained unresolved. The tension between wizards and goblins persisted, bubbling beneath the surface of wizarding society like a cauldron set to simmer. In the aftermath of the Goblin Rebellions, the wizarding world entered a fragile and uneasy peace, one that was maintained more by weariness than by resolution. While the Ministry of Magic declared the goblins subdued, any claim of victory rang hollow. The scars of the conflict ran too deep, and the structural inequalities that had caused the rebellions remained intact. Goblins returned to their forges and vaults, their magical prowess still indispensable to wizarding society, but the lingering resentment ensured that relations remained strained. This period saw the gradual rise of unspoken but deliberate segregation. Goblins and wizards lived parallel lives with limited interaction beyond transactional relationships. Gringotts, once a symbol of goblin ingenuity, became their most visible point of contact with the wizarding world, a towering testament to goblin brilliance, but also a reminder of their exclusion. For wizards, it was a place of awe and caution, where the air of mistrust lingered like smoke. But what of the lessons learnt, or not learnt, from the Goblin Rebellions? History, as written by wizards, often paints these conflicts as unfortunate but necessary, a triumph of order over chaos. Goblins, on the other hand, view them as a tragic chapter in an ongoing struggle for equality. To this day, the cultural divide between wizards and goblins remains unresolved, a shadow over even the most mundane interactions. Take, for instance, the legacy of goblin-made artifacts. Items like the Sword of Godric Gryffindor and the Tiara of Ravenclaw are celebrated in wizarding culture, but their origins are rarely acknowledged with the respect they deserve. Wizards often treat goblin creations as trophies, failing to recognize the deeper significance these objects hold for goblins. The tensions over ownership persist, with goblins still believing that crafted objects carry a piece of their maker's soul, and therefore cannot truly belong to anyone else. The lack of resolution to these cultural disputes points to a broader truth about wizarding society. its reluctance to confront uncomfortable histories. Wizards, for all their magical prowess, have often struggled to acknowledge the cost of their own power. The Goblin Rebellions are a prime example of this, a reminder that even in a world of enchantments and wonders, prejudice and inequality can wield their own destructive magic. Yet there are glimmers of hope in the pages of history. The modern wizarding world, though far from perfect, has seen growing recognition of goblin contributions. Figures like Hermione Granger, known for her tireless work in promoting the rights of magical creatures, have drawn attention to the injustices of the past. Goblins, too, have begun to reclaim their narrative, sharing their stories and challenging the wizarding community to see them as equals rather than subordinates. It's tempting to view the Goblin Rebellions as distant history, a series of bloody battles confined to the annals of time, but their legacy is far more immediate. The prejudices that fueled those conflicts still ripple through wizarding society, shaping policies, relationships, and perceptions to this day. The goblins fight for recognition. Their demand to be seen as more than mere craftsmen or vault keepers remains a poignant reminder that peace built on inequality is no peace at all. Perhaps the true lesson of the Goblin Rebellions lies not in their violence, but in their aftermath. The call for understanding that went unheeded. As wizards and goblins continue to share a world divided by history, there remains the hope that future generations might succeed where their predecessors failed. For as much as the Goblin Rebellions were a story of blood and betrayal, they were also a story of resilience, of a people who refused to let their voices be silenced, and of a magical world still learning how to reckon with its past. And so, the tale of the Goblin Rebellions stands as a haunting chapter in wizarding history, both a warning and a challenge. Will the wizarding world rise to meet it, or will the ghosts of the past forever haunt its future? Only time and perhaps a bit of magic will tell.